Once again, very good evening to one and all. I welcome you all to the Clinical Infectious Disease Society, CIDS SIDS webinar on COVID vaccines. And we had conducted a lot of SIDS webinars last year. And of course, our SIDSCon that was conducted last year too, and it was well attended. And right now, I think the current flavor of the season is COVID vaccines. The common questions that I get to ask, as everyone in mind, is this questions. Should we take the vaccine? Yes, no. If yes, what vaccine? What will be the side effects? And that's the question running into the minds of every Indian clinician, let it be even an average Indian public. Hopefully at the end of this session, we have some clear-cut answers on whether we should vaccinate. If so, with what vaccine? What is the current evidence? And all through the vaccines, all about the vaccines at the end of it. And this was planned in a very, very short notice. I know that we are watching right now Test cricket, but this was like a T20 match. And everything was planned in a very short notice over last Sunday. And then Monday, I got in touch with the participants, and they were, all the faculty were kind enough to oblige. And I thank all of them for kind of accepting it a very, very, very short notice. And on a personal note too, I thank a lot for obliging. And people can watch this session live through two media. One is through the Zoom platform. If you have already registered for the webinar, the vaccine webinar, you would have had an email link sent to your email ID. If you're in the within first 1,000 delegates, you would be able to watch in through the Zoom platform. If not, probably you could watch through the YouTube channel where it will be streamed live. All you have to type is SIDS webinars. If you do that, you will be able to access this session live. And even you could subscribe to SIDS webinars. There are already 1,000 subscribers for it. And all our past activities is also hosted in that YouTube channel on SIDS webinars. All you have to do type is SIDS webinars. And Clinical Infectious Disease Society is a society of ID physicians, microbiologists, and people interested in infectious diseases in India. And it's a small society which has been in vogue for more than a decade. And our premier conference is SIDSCon, which has its own standing value in our country. And I request physicians and like-minded clinicians who are interested in the field of infectious diseases, who wants to be updated on the field of infectious diseases, please do join our society, Clinical Infectious Disease Society, or at least go through the website, which has a lot of content, which is updated. And we have our monthly newsletter, which is a compendium of the developments in the field of infectious diseases. If you miss the journals for a month, don't worry about it. All you have to go through our SIDS newsletter. I request Indian physicians, clinicians, microbiologists to join our society so that the specialty of infectious diseases in our country grows. And we've already had around 300 participants have logged in, and our official time that we had decided to start is around 7 p.m. And we would start our first activity for the webinar. That would be the lecture by Professor Dr. O.C. Abraham, who would be giving us an overview on COVID vaccines. And he is the president of our society, and glad to be working along with him to carry out the goals of our society. And Professor O.C. does not need any introduction, so I'm not going to introduce him. He is Professor of Medicine, and he is a teacher in the field of infectious diseases. I hand over the further proceedings to Professor Dr. O.C. Abraham to give us an overview on COVID vaccines. It will be a 25-minute to 30-minute lecture. After that, we will have the panel discussion. Off to Professor Dr. O.C.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Nambi, for those kind words of introduction. As a society, it is our endeavor to bring you authentic and up-to-date information. And this webinar on COVID vaccines is one among this series. So what I'm going to do is that I will share with you a brief overview of the COVID-19 vaccines. As Nambi said, there is an eminent panel who will be answering all your questions in real time following me. So my task is made much easier. So these are my disclosures, and this is the outline of my presentation. 4 questions I will try to answer. Number 1, why do you need vaccines for COVID-19? Number 2, we will briefly discuss about the COVID vaccine development timeline and the pipeline. I will also briefly discuss the process of vaccine development, specifically COVID-19 vaccines. We will also look at the approved COVID-19 vaccines which are gone through all the phases of clinical trials and has won some regulatory approvals in some countries in the world. And finally, there are lots of unanswered questions. I will briefly touch upon them. The panel will elaborate on that subsequently. Why do we need vaccines for COVID-19? The answer is very simple. We are in the middle of a pandemic which has caused substantial morbidity and mortality across the globe. As of today, there are 98 million cases and 2 million deaths caused by this pandemic. And the estimate of infection fatality rate, that is, if you get infected with SARS-CoV-2, your risk of dying is 1.15%, or roughly about 11 to 12 of the 1,000 who die from this viral infection. And as most of you know, unfortunately, there is no effective treatment, no antiviral agents approved for either treatment or prevention, which can cure or reliably prevent the infection. And if you look at the history of vaccination in general, we can be heartened by the fact that vaccines greatly reduce burden of infections. As far as public health interventions go, vaccines are only next to clean drinking water. So that's the impact of vaccines. And we also know that if you look at the history of vaccines and vaccination, the benefits of vaccines far outweigh the risks. We will look at the timeline of development of COVID-19 vaccines. This is unprecedented in the history of vaccinations. As we know, it was in late November or early December of 2019 that the unusual pneumonia appeared in Wuhan in China. And within a month, by January, the SARS-CoV-2 was sequenced and the gene was available, sequence was available in the public domain. The first phase 3 trial for the COVID vaccines began in May, within about 5 months, remarkable. And by November, 6 months later, first efficacy data was released. And this is the most recent information. 41 vaccines in phase 1 trials, 22 in phase 2, 20 in phase 3, 9 vaccines are approved for limited use and 2 approved for full use. And unfortunately, one Australian vaccine, they abandoned the trials because of lack of efficacy. This remarkable achievement, vaccine development at lightning speed, has been due to 2 important reasons. Number 1 was use of these vaccine platforms. So this technology was already available to you. And there are 2 kinds of platforms, the classical platforms and the next generation platforms. The classical platforms can be whole inactivated virus. This is the killed virus. You use the whole virus. You can have a live attenuated virus, a virus, but it is weakened. It is no longer pathogenic, but retains its antigenicity. Or you can have a subunit, the spike protein, the receptor binding domain of the spike protein of the virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, which mediates attachment with the host cell. Or you can have a virus particle. The classical example is the human papilloma virus, where it is the whole virus minus the genome and the non-structural proteins. For the development of COVID-19 vaccines, a lot of the vaccines have used what are called the next generation platforms. You can use a viral vector to deliver genetic sequences, which code for antigens from the virus to the host. Most commonly used viral vectors are adenoviral vectors. You can use the DNA alone. You can use the RNA or the mRNA, or you can use antigen presenting cells to deliver the antigens to the host. So usage of these platforms, which are already available, remarkably speeded up the process of the vaccine development. Second one was the vaccine development process itself. This is the traditional mode, which can take up to 10 to 15 years. There is a lot of preclinical studies, including animal experiments, identifying the antigen, protective responses, animal experiments. Then you go through phase 1, which is basically safety studies, phase 2, which is basically looking at safety and immunogenicity, and large phase 3 clinical trials among volunteers to assess safety and clinical efficacy, followed by approval. And then there is, of course, post-marketing surveillance for unanticipated side effects. This whole process can take up to 10 to 15 years. Excuse me. However, this whole process has been compressed into 12 to 24 months. For COVID vaccines, actually 12 months, because of merging of the various phases and the ready availability of the various vaccine platforms. So the criticism that we have not really gone through the process of real vaccine development does not stand scrutiny when you look at the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development. This is because we have invested years and years and lots of money in the technology of vaccine development for other pathogens. So today, this is data from WHO. We have 64 candidate vaccines undergoing clinical trial in phase 3, various protein subunit, viral vector, DNA vaccines, inactivated virus, so on and so forth. And these are the 9 vaccines which have been won some kind of authorization of approval in various countries. This is the Pfizer vaccine, which is an mRNA-based vaccine. This is the Moderna, again, an mRNA-based vaccine. These two are the ones approved in the most number of countries. This is a Chinese vaccine, CoronaVac, which uses an inactivated whole cell vaccine as the antigen, whole virus. This is approved for use in China, Bolivia, Turkey, Indonesia, and Brazil. Phase 3 results are yet to be published. It's available in websites, but not published. Phase 2 results have been published. The AstraZeneca ChAdOx vaccine, developed by Oxford University, developed by AstraZeneca and manufactured by Serum Institute of India and marketed as Covishield in India, which uses an adenovirus vector for delivering the S gene to the host. This is approved in many countries, including India. The Sputnik vaccine, the Russian vaccine developed by Gamaleya Research Institute. The phase 2 trials have been published. Phase 3, if you look at the website of Gamaleya Research Institute, they claim 90% efficacy, but it's not available in preprint or published forms yet. Approved for use in many countries, including Russia, several South American countries, Hungary, etc. China has another inactivated vaccine called BBIBP Corvi, again approved for use in China and a lot of GCC countries. And finally, the Covaxin from Bharat Biotech, approved for use in India. What I will do in the next few minutes is go over the 2 mRNA vaccines, which are the first to be licensed for use, the ChAdOx vaccine and the Covax vaccine. What is the data available? This is the Moderna vaccine, an mRNA vaccine. The results of this phase 3 trial was published in a recent New England Journal of Medicine on 31st of December. Study used about 29,000 participants, 14,500 received the vaccine, and 14,500 received the placebo. And the endpoint was symptomatic, virologically confirmed COVID-19. That these patients, 1 week after receipt of the second dose, they had to develop symptoms consistent with COVID-19, which was confirmed by a PCR which turned out to be positive. As you can see, remarkable efficacy. Among vaccine recipients, there were 11 cases of symptomatic COVID-19, while there were 185 cases in the placebo arm. And the severe COVID, there were none in the mRNA, the vaccine recipients, and there were 30 cases in the placebo recipients. So the vaccine efficacy in preventing symptomatic COVID was 94%. Remarkable indeed, as shown by this Kaplan-Meier curve. This is the Pfizer vaccine. Again, very similar story. About 26,000 patients were randomized. Half of them, 46,000 patients were randomized, half of them to receive the placebo, half to receive the vaccine. Again, the endpoint was very similar, development of symptomatic COVID-19, laboratory confirmed COVID-19, 7 days after receipt of the second dose. Again, you can see the Kaplan-Meier curve here, which starts to diverge after about 7 days after receipt of the second dose of the vaccine. Again, the vaccine efficacy was 95%. So this was indeed, it sent all the ID clinicians, virologists, epidemiologists, program managers, all of us were really excited. Fantastic. Very seldom do you see vaccine efficacy this good. There are several unanswered questions. I'll come to that in a minute. We will move on to Chadox vaccine and Covaxin, because that is what is available in our country. Chadox vaccine uses a chimpanzee adenovirus vector. This is an inactivated vector. It is not replication competent. That means it does not multiply inside the host. It is developed by the Jenner Institute in Oxford University. That's why it's called the Chadox vaccine, chimpanzee adenovirus developed by Oxford University. This is originally developed for the SARS coronavirus, original one, and they quickly borrowed this platform for SARS-CoV-2. This is what happens, modified chimpanzee adenovirus, into which is incorporated the genetic code for the S protein, the spike protein. And this is used as a vector. And the trial was published, the phase 3 trial results were published in a recent issue of Lancet. There were 2 trials actually, one in UK, phase 3 trials, and one in Brazil. There was a little bit of a mess up. The initial part of the UK trial, there was an error in the dosing because of a manufacturing error. So some patients, participants in UK got half the dose initially, low dose, followed by the booster was the standard dose. And the latter part, and all the Brazilian patients got the standard dose initial, the prime and the booster. The vaccine efficacy was 70.4% when they combined all the patients in the phase 3 trials, UK and Brazil trials. When they looked at all the patients who got only the standard dose as the initial dose and the booster, the vaccine efficacy was 62%. The confidence interval was from 41% to 75%. Again, not as good as the mRNA vaccines, but decent enough. And these are the Kaplan-Meier curves for the entire cohort and those who got the first and second as the standard dose. So very good vaccine again. One thing I would like to emphasize here is that the Chadox vaccine had a lot of exclusion criteria. It included only adults above the age of 18. There was no upper age limit cutoff. A lot of exclusion criteria, prior receipt of any vaccines within 30 days of enrollment, diagnosis or treatment of cancer, serious psychiatric condition, bleeding disorder, anticoagulant use, alcohol or drug dependency, those who had received immunoglobulins within 3 months, immunodeficiency state, immunosuppressive medications, autoimmune conditions, history of allergic diseases, history of angioedema, severe or uncontrolled cardiovascular, respiratory, neurological, liver, renal or endocrine diseases, pregnant or nursing patients. What is disappointing here is that a lot of these underlying conditions make the patient vulnerable to develop the severe forms of COVID-19. Unfortunately, they were excluded in the trial. So there is a little bit of hesitance in extrapolating the results of this trial. We will look at Covaxin, which has been approved for use in India. This is a vaccine which should make all of us proud as Indians. This is a whole virion inactivated SARS-CoV-2. This strain of SARS-CoV-2 was isolated and characterized in National Institute of Virology, Pune. ICMR collaborated with Bharat Biotech company to develop this vaccine. So the technology is also different from the mRNA and the adenoviral vector vaccine. They use the whole virion, which has been inactivated. This is an entirely Indian effort developed by ICMR and Bharat Biotech. Preclinical and phase 1 and 2 studies have been completed. Phase 3 trials are still ongoing and we don't have results from phase 3 yet. Phase 1 and 2 trials. Phase 1 has been published. Phase 2 is available as a preprint and at the company's website. And what are the results? There were no immediate adverse events occurring within 2 hours after vaccination. There were no serious adverse events reported, and the immunogenicity was good, both neutralizing antibody titers, which was suggestive of protection, and there were also the vaccine could elicit T cell responses. We are still awaiting phase 3 results from this vaccine. This vaccine has also been approved in India, and if you have been following the media, there have been a lot of concerns regarding the approval of this vaccine in India. This is verbatim reproduction from the recommendations of the Subject Expert Committee of the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, an arm of Drug Controller General of India. So they have recommended that this vaccine may be granted permission for restricted use in emergency situation as an abundant precaution in clinical trial mode, because we have more options for vaccination and the possibility of infection by mutant strains. So it is not an unconditional authorization for generalized use. It's only for restricted use in emergency situation, pending availability of safety and efficacy data from ongoing phase 3 clinical trials, which should be completed anytime soon, and the data should be available pretty soon. What about adverse reactions from these vaccines? Generally, vaccines are very safe, and as expected, both the ChAdOx vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, and the Pfizer vaccine, most of what you have is local and systemic reactions because they are reactogenic vaccines. Pain at the site of injection, arm pain, virtually every patient. Seems to be a little bit more in the mRNA vaccines, and even in the mRNA vaccine, the frequency of side effects are a little bit more in the Moderna vaccine. You can have systemic effects like chills, fever, joint pains, muscle ache, fatigue, headache. This appears about 1 or 2 days after vaccination and subsides soon. All you need is paracetamol and some non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen. What about serious adverse events? mRNA vaccines have attracted a lot of interest because of the occurrence of anaphylactic reactions. The frequency is about 1 in 1 lakh population, approximately. There was an update in today's JAMA, roughly about 1 per 1 lakh, which is much less frequent than even anaphylaxis due to penicillin, which is 1 in 50,000. A few cases of Bell's palsy have been reported among recipients of the mRNA vaccine. Again, no pattern here, which is people are keeping a watch on this. One case of transverse myelitis possibly related to the vaccine was reported in the ChAdOx vaccine trial. The trial was paused. There was a lot of investigation. So the final conclusion of an adjudication committee was this was possibly related to the vaccine. However, the patient did very well and has recovered with treatment. So those are the serious adverse events. But this will be monitored very closely in the post-marketing surveillance. And by now, lakhs and lakhs of doses have been dispensed across the world. There is nothing alarming by way of serious adverse events. There are many unanswered questions. We don't know the durability of protection. Even though immunogenicity has been proven, clinical efficacy has been proven, how long will it last? We don't know. These are all new vaccines. Trials have been completed only recently. We don't know how long it will last. Efficacy in high-risk groups. As I said, the ChAdOx vaccine trials excluded patients who belong to the high-risk group. There was no age cutoff, but underlying immunosuppression, serious medical disorders, all those kinds of patients were excluded. So we don't know whether it works, whether this vaccines prevent asymptomatic infection and therefore onward transmission. We have information from the Moderna vaccine trial and the ChAdOx vaccine. These trials were not designed to answer this question, but the small number of asymptomatic infections which occurred in both the Moderna vaccine and the ChAdOx vaccine, the numbers were substantially higher in the placebo recipients. So probably, most likely, this prevent also asymptomatic infection, not just symptomatic COVID. What about efficacy against variants? What about efficacy against the UK variant, the South Africa variant, the Brazil variant? We don't know the answer yet. These are all vaccines targeted against the spike protein. So there are mutations in the spike protein in all the variants which I just now mentioned. Will it work? We don't know yet. There is ongoing research. We'll have to wait for results. And finally, the long-term safety. Generally, the side effects associated with these vaccines are evident during the first 2 or 3 months post receipt of vaccine, apart from the reactogenicity and hypersensitivity reactions. Till now, there are no signals which say that there is any major toxicity. So to conclude, we today, within an year of discovery of the virus, we have safe and effective vaccines available. Effective, not as effective as measles vaccine or hepatitis B vaccine or the chickenpox vaccine. There, in these conditions, if you get the vaccine, you can more or less be assured you're protected from the disease, like a decent influenza vaccine. We need more data on long-term effects, both duration of immune response, protective efficacy, a lot of other unknowns which I mentioned just now. And last but not least, if you are vaccinated, can you disregard all other prevention measures, avoiding crowds, crowded indoor spaces especially? Can you disregard masks, distancing, hand washing? The answer is a firm no. You have to continue. This is only one more additional layer of protection. So I'll conclude my presentation there. Thank you all for your attention. And we have an eminent panel who will be ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank Professor Osi for his clear, lucid lecture. And already we've had quite a bit of questions in the chat box. One request is the delegates, please type your question in the chat box. I don't think we will have time for raise of hands and then so that you can talk live, something like that. Please type your questions in the chat box. We'll start ahead with the panel discussion. We are on time and panel discussion is scheduled for 60 minutes. In case there are much more questions to be answered, probably we can extend for 10 minutes more so that we wind by 8:40 p.m. max. We have two moderators for this panel discussion. One is Dr. Neha Gupta, who is an infectious disease consultant practicing at Delhi. She works with the Medanta Hospital. And then other person is Dr. Rajalakshmi, who is an infectious disease consultant who practices at Trivandrum. She works with the KIMS Hospital. She also heads the infection control services for the KIMS Hospital in the Kerala chain. And I request both of you to give preference to the questions that are in the chat box. I know that you both have prepared a set of questions to kind of test the panel's reserves with respect to COVID vaccines. But if possible, if those questions, the audience questions are not answered, please include that in your discussion. Off to Dr. Neha and Dr. Rajalakshmi, please start with your panel discussion. And please start with the introduction to the eminent panel that we have. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much, first of all, Dr. Nambi, as well as Dr. Osi for inviting us here. And it was an excellent lecture by Osi sir. We have esteemed panelists with us today, Dr. George M. Verghese, who's Professor of Infectious Diseases, CMC Vellore. We have Dr. Vasant Nagvekar, who's Infectious Diseases Specialist in Leelavati Hospital, as well as Global Hospital, Mumbai. We have Dr. Subramanian Swaminathan, who is Infectious Diseases Specialist in Gleneagles Global Hospital, Chennai. And Dr. Surabhi Madan, who is Consultant Infectious Diseases in SIMS Hospital, Ahmedabad. So myself and Dr. Rajalakshmi, we will be moderating this session, and it's over to you, Dr. Rajalakshmi.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to this panel discussion. So I have made a set of questions, and then in between we can take chat questions or at the end, so that we can answer those unanswered questions all together. And please feel free to put any sort of questions in the chat box, and we'll definitely try to answer those. So let me start straight away with this question addressed to Dr. George. So we have heard something from Dr. Osi about the vaccine efficacy. So is there a difference between efficacy and effectiveness of vaccine? And does it really matter in practice? Can you please explain? Is efficacy the word, or in practice, do we have as much as efficacy as we see in print?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. When we talk about efficiency of any vaccine in preventing a disease, these are the two terminologies which people often refer to. And we must remember that these two are in two different settings. So when we say efficacy, we refer to clinical trial results. So where it is all controlled conditions. Like if you have listened to Dr. Osi, the Chadox vaccine, the Covishield, there were a lot of exclusions. And therefore, the generalizability becomes an issue. You also know that, in the real life, when it is widely given to the public, the results may be different. So the efficacy of a vaccine essentially is the percentage reduction of disease among the vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated. So this, there are several factors which could affect, for example, age. Older the age, the immune response may be lower, and therefore you may not get the same efficacy. The immune status of the patient. There are several other factors, including the vaccine factors, the storage, the transportation, all that. So in a clinical trial where all these are controlled and given an ideal setting, you get a value. For example, the mRNA vaccines, you have 95% efficacy. When it is rolled out to the real world, the efficiency in preventing the disease will be lower. So usually that is what is referred to as the effectiveness of the vaccine. So where all the other factors come in. Just to give you an example, measles vaccine, the efficacy is about 95%. When you look at the efficiency or the effectiveness, when you roll it out in the community, it is roughly around 85%. So that is what is normally seen. And therefore, we must be clear what we are looking at. And influenza, again, I'm sure Vasant will talk about the difference between the efficacy and efficiency. Influenza, because it's an antigen which, it's a virus which keeps on changing the antigen very quickly. The prediction of the antigenic variation matters a lot. And therefore, the efficacy itself, you start off with a lower efficacy, maybe around 70%. And the efficiency will be even lower. So it does matter. And we need to know whether we are talking about efficacy in clinical trial or efficiency when it's given to the public.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. It's just to make a point that we compare the efficacy of different vaccines, but in reality, what is effectiveness? That is how, when we roll out, and what is the population that we are going to address. All this bring the effectiveness of the vaccine. In studies, it is, or in any trial, it's done in a controlled manner where healthy set of population are selected, and then you have a result called efficacy based on the results. I mean, how much percentage of infection is prevented and so on. But in real life, it all depends on the host as well as the cold chain, which is very, very important. Thank you. So we will go to the next question. What is the minimum efficacy needed for a vaccine? Is there such thing? And do you compare, how do you compare this flu vaccine with COVID vaccine? Because we know, it's easy to imagine how much a flu vaccine is protecting us and how better or worse is COVID vaccine. Probably that will also remove some of the hesitancy and inhibition and the questions about the efficacy differences between two vaccines that we compare always, especially with the mRNA and the Indian vaccines. Can I ask Dr. Vasant to address this?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Rajlakshmi, for this question. I think Dr. George has already made it very clear what is the difference between efficacy and effectiveness of the vaccine. Efficacy is how much the vaccine prevents the disease compared to a non-vaccinated person. And to have a minimum, what should be the minimum efficacy needed for a vaccine to be rolled out? I think what has been said, ideally it would have been good, 60-70%, but anything more than 50% efficacy is good enough for a vaccine to be, to be taken on. So that is what is the efficacy part. And the second part of the question is that how do you compare? Maybe the efficacy minimum, what they say is 50%. It could be later on maybe 70, 80, 90, and it can vary. So similarly, like influenza vaccine, it was 60 to 70% efficacy, but the effectiveness is only 40 or 50%. So similarly. So coming to the next question was, what is the difference between the efficacy of flu vaccine with the COVID vaccine? I think very important to understand is the assessment of the efficacy of a vaccine is complex for many diseases, but particularly so in case of SARS-CoV-2, where the fundamental understanding of the pathogen is still evolving. And also different platforms are being used and technologies are being used for which differ in the strength and relevant in a distinct epidemiology context. Now coming to relevant of this question, we have to understand that flu vaccine is a completely different from COVID vaccine, because flu vaccine has both the viruses are different. This is an influenza virus and this is a coronavirus. That is one thing. Second thing is, flu vaccine targets multiple influenza viruses, like it could be influenza A, H3N2, or it could be B and B, subgroups in that. It may target 3 or 4 influenza viruses, whereas COVID, it is targeting a single vaccine, that is coronavirus, the spike protein. All the vaccines are towards that, the spike protein. Second difference between this is for development of a flu vaccine, it almost, I think Dr. O.C. Abraham made it very clear that it almost took 40 to 70 years. Whereas for this, it was less than a year. So that was this. Both clinical wise have similar symptoms. Both are contagious and have similar symptoms of cold, cough, and whatever fever. So if you see the efficacy of flu vaccine, it is around 60 to 70%, but effectiveness is only 40 to 50%. Whereas COVID vaccine, again, there are different COVID, as I said in the beginning, the COVID vaccines are being made by different platforms and different technologies. So if you see the mRNA vaccine, the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine was around 95%, whereas the mRNA vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, is around 92 to 93% efficacy. Whereas the AstraZeneca, that is the Covishield vaccine, which is the chimpanzee bone, vector bone vaccine, which is being rolled out in India, the efficacy was slightly different with 2 different doses in the AstraZeneca, where they found it overall efficacy was around 60 to 70%. But when used half the dose in one of the African countries, they saw that the efficacy was more than 90%. So if you compare influenza and COVID vaccine, the efficacy of a COVID vaccine is much, much higher. In fact, close to 90%, whereas the influenza vaccine virus efficacy is only 60 to 70%. So that is the difference between these 2 vaccines.
Okay. So can we go to the next question to Dr. Subra? The most important aspect of the current vaccine is safety. I think more are worried about safety than efficacy. So how to address this concern so that we can overcome the hesitancy?
So let's understand why safety is so important. There's a different threshold for acceptance of a vaccine as compared to a medication. When we are talking about treating a very severe disease, let's say we have a patient with severe COVID on a ventilator, you're essentially treating a patient who is already very sick. And therefore, the risk of side effects is something that you're willing to accept. And you're hoping that they'll benefit. On the other hand, when we use a vaccine, remember, we are giving it to people who are otherwise perfectly fine. And the benefit for them is in theory, in that they may get the disease and this may prevent it. And therefore, the vaccine may be helpful, but the risk of side effect is actually quite real. And therefore, the bar in terms of safety is much higher for a preventive intervention like a vaccination as compared to a medication. That's why medications get EUA very quickly, whereas vaccines This is the first time I've ever heard of a vaccine getting a EUA. Probably Ebola and things like that must have got it. But outside of that, this is the first time that a large-scale EUA has been given across the world for a vaccine. So remember that vaccines have a much higher burden of proof required for it to come into the public domain. So obviously people are concerned that given that the duration of information that's available to us is so short, are we sure we have all the details? Now, the way to look at it is, number one, how big is the threat? And number two, how much data do we have? Now, we all know the threat. We still know that COVID is not out of the picture and that it is still circulating and there is a possibility of a second wave. Obviously, in India, second wave doesn't seem to be a big deal as of right now, but we never know if it could mutate and come back and things like that. So the threat of COVID is still there. Now, so the threat is real. Now, what about the risk of it? Now, the good news is it has already been used, like Dr. Rosie pointed out, in a few lakh doses across the world. At least the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, a few lakh doses have been already distributed across the world, both in terms of the study and also as part of the EUA. And we know that the number of adverse events are comparable to any other vaccine you would normally use. That's number one. The second reassuring thing is that the technology is not particularly new. Having an adenovirus vector, this is not the first vaccine to do so. The Ebola vaccine actually used the same principle. And as far as Covaxin is concerned, it's a killed virus vaccine. And we have a lot of other killed virus vaccines, including the flu vaccine. So therefore, both of these technologies are not something which are absolutely unheard of, untested, or unknown. The mRNA vaccine obviously is a bit of a game changer. And obviously the burden of proof should be higher over there. But these two vaccines, fortunately for us, are built on technology that we already have for a long time. At least one of them was a very long time, the other one for some amount of time. And therefore, could be reasonably expected to be rather safe. And remember, there will be adverse events for any vaccine. There is no vaccine with a perfect, unblemished record. So the question is this more than what you would expect for any other vaccine is what the question is. And so far as we can see, the signal for unusual effects does not seem to be significantly higher than any of the other comparable vaccines which we give for adults or pediatrics for that matter. Obviously, the government is going slow and only selecting people in certain categories to take this. We are not yet recommending it to all kinds of people who could be more vulnerable and things like that. I'm sure we'll be discussing that later. So obviously, it's a very rational approach. And therefore, we should expect that we should have reasonably very, very low risk due to the vaccine by itself.
Thank you so much, because that's a main hindrance to overcome the hesitancy. And there are a lot of questions about special population, which we'll be addressing. But as such, the safety concern, I see the majority of side effects are minor, just like which happens with any other vaccines like fever, headache, and myalgia. And it's in good number, as you can see in the Astra, that is Oxford Astra vaccine that is in the fact sheet, which is published in the UK portal. And you can see that any minor reaction is up to more than 50%. And pain, fatigue, headache, myalgia, malaise is all very common. And pyrexia happens up to 30%. So these are all expected minor side effects, and which can happen in 1 to 2 days later and subsides in 1 or 2 days with paracetamol. And this should not be a concern at all. Can I have the next slide? Sure. Yeah, so now we'll go to the next question. The allergies, yes. So we have a lot of question about allergy, and there are a lot of confusion also whether drug, food, or vaccine allergy, which is important. And how to address this? Should we recommend vaccines for those with mild allergy to drug or food, or only vaccine allergy? And what are the specific components that we are concerned about? And to address this, I request Dr. Surabhi.
Yeah, hi. So of course, allergy is a concern. And if we look at the pack inserts which have been issued by the two manufacturers, that is Covishield and Covaxin. So of course, hypersensitivity to any of the components of the vaccine and hypersensitivity to a previous dose. They are absolute contraindications where we cannot administer the vaccine. However, if we look at the Covaxin pack insert, they have played very safe, and they recommend that if you have any allergy, then the vaccine should not be administered. Now, what we understand by any allergy is history of any allergy means it could be food allergy, it could be drug allergy. So there we don't have a clear-cut recommendation. However, in the Covishield, that is the AstraZeneca Serum Institute vaccine, there they have not mentioned anything specific apart from the hypersensitivity to the excipients of the vaccine. Now we have to take a very detailed history, I believe. A person who is going to take the vaccine, we need to ask what kind of allergy the patient has, if there is at all any history of allergy, whether it's just a mild allergic rhinitis sort of, or is there any history of severe food allergy including hives or urticarial rashes, is there any history of previous vaccine anaphylaxis or allergy, because there are so many components which are common to many vaccines. For example, aluminium is one of the adsorbent which is used commonly in so many vaccines. Similarly, polyethylene glycol, which has been, which is thought to be, could have been the reason for IgE-mediated anaphylactic reactions to the mRNA, Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Similarly, polysorbate is another excipient which could be responsible for the allergic reactions to the vaccine. So I believe history would be very important. We will need to ask what is the type of allergy which the patient, which the individual is suffering from. Is it so severe so that we have to just avoid the vaccine in that person? I believe if it's a mild allergy, then there is no reason not to administer the vaccine, at least Covishield. Covaxin, yes, we have to, because the manufacturer itself has issued in the pack insert that if there is any history of allergy, then it is contraindicated. Now, about the long-term allergy and side effect concern, as Dr. Osi already mentioned, most of the times the side effects with the vaccines are reflected in the initial 3 to 6 months. And if we look at the mRNA and the AstraZeneca vaccines, we already have good follow-up in the trial as well as in the after they have been launched in the market. So I believe that apart from the delayed hypersensitivity reactions, which could be a problem with some of the components like aluminium, which could lead to, some local site nodular hypersensitivity. Apart from that, I don't see there is any long-term allergy or side effect concern associated with the vaccines.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the important concern is there is some overlap of PEG allergy with polysorbate. So if you have a history of a PEG allergy to some other medication that has PEG, maybe you have to be careful about using a vaccine which has polysorbate, which that can be an overlap of allergic reaction. You have to explain that. And regarding long-term allergies, we don't have much data, and always go and please be aware of the package insert of which vaccine you use and what are the recommendations in the package insert, because there are some difference between Covishield and Covaxin. Yeah.
I believe a detailed explanation and possibly a written consent if a person who has history of allergy and still chooses to take the vaccine should also be a part of the whole process.
Exactly. Yeah. Because this is not a compulsory vaccine, and we can explain the risk, and then in such situation, definitely to take a consent and then go ahead.
Sure, sir. We'll move on to the next case. And this is, I'll request Dr. George to address this. This is a 40-year-old healthcare worker with no other comorbidities, and he's due to get his Covaxin in his institute. And then he seeks ID advice like, this is what it is, whether I should go ahead with this vaccine or not. That's the first question which he has. So whether to get vaccinated or not is his query.
Well, whether to get vaccinated or not, it has to be an individual decision, because we know that Covaxin is still in the clinical trial mode. So the phase 3 trials are not out yet. Phase 2 is just out. Therefore, particularly, when you're taking Covaxin, it has to be an informed decision. it is an attenuated vaccine, and therefore, people would like to see more results. So it is not something which everyone will take. That individual decision has to be the most important thing. And I'm sure once we have more data available, the confidence in taking this vaccine will be much more. The issue now really is we don't have sufficient data to vaccinate widely.
And the second query which he has is whether. And the second query which he has is that in case he gets the first dose of Covaxin, can he get vaccinated with the Covishield later on?
That is very clear. You should not switch vaccines. Even mRNA vaccines, two mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, if you have taken one, it is not recommended to use the other one for the second dose. So certainly not Covaxin and Covishield one after another. So that is not recommended.
Absolutely. It has to be the same brand of vaccine which should be completing the course or the schedule of the vaccination. Now, Dr. Basant, this is a 40-year-old gentleman. He's a cardiologist, and he has the opinion that he would like to wait for the mRNA vaccines rather than taking the vaccination right now. So what are your comments on this? Would you advise him to wait, or would you advise him to just go ahead with the current vaccination strategies?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is it's an individualized decision whether should he get vaccinated or not. It's a voluntary decision. So, you can't force him to, you have to get vaccine because the mRNA is not available. So you have to go in for the Covishield, that is the AstraZeneca one, or the Covaxin from the Bharat Serum Institute. So if he's preferring an mRNA vaccine, so as I said, it is voluntary. But then the reason is why is he, preferring the mRNA vaccine? Maybe there is possibly more data to say that the efficacy of the vaccine of Pfizer, which is demonstrated as more than 95%, and for the Moderna, which is also an mRNA vaccine, which is demonstrated, efficacy of 92 to 93%. Whereas the Oxford AstraZeneca, as I earlier answered, that the efficacy has been around 70%, but in some selected trials, it has shown that more than 90%. That possibly may be the reason why is he waiting for the mRNA vaccine. But my advice would be, if you are going to get vaccinated, then do not wait for the mRNA vaccine. And it is better to get vaccinated and not to have a disease waiting for the mRNA vaccine. So my advice to the cardiologist would be, if you have decided to get vaccinated, you please go ahead and get vaccinated with the Covishield, that is the Oxford vaccine, which is available, and then, and not wait for the mRNA. It's always better to get vaccinated if you're decided for it and not have the disease and then get it crippled.
Absolutely. I think rather than waiting for the vaccination, it is better to go ahead with the vaccine, Covishield. So this is for Dr. Subra. Actually, I will request Dr. Subri Madan to address this. This is a 66-year-old gentleman who is HIV-1 positive, and now he's actually seeking advice for the pneumococcal influenza as well as the COVID vaccine. He has no past history of COVID-19 in the past. So when and how should he get vaccinated? So with all these three vaccines which are indicated in patients with HIV, how would you suggest him to get vaccinated?
Yeah, because we don't have any data on co-administration of other vaccines with COVID-19, the advice is at present is to keep a gap of 14 days between the COVID-19 vaccine and the other vaccines. The reason is there is no data at present. We have been administering various vaccines together that we have been doing routinely. But because COVID-19, we don't have any data, that's why we should follow the advisory. However, if any other vaccine is an emergency, like if it is a rabies vaccine which has to be taken, or if it is a tetanus vaccine, then of course we should not wait and administer that emergency vaccine definitely. But otherwise 14 days is the duration which is advised at present.
Sure. And this is for Dr. Subra. This is a 40-year-old neurologist who has got sarcoidosis. It's just mild. He's also on prednisolone. So I think I'll request Dr. Rajlakshmi to take up this particular case and discuss it with Dr. Subra.
Let's go to this problem of giving COVID vaccine to special populations. So one of the special population is those on immunosuppressants of some form. And the common form is some of drugs that we use for some of the rheumatology conditions. So if this case of sarcoidosis with prednisolone, and he's scheduled for COVID-19 vaccine, what do you do? Whether to get vaccine straight away, is there any point in giving vaccine, or should we wait?
Well, see, the problem is that, like Dr. Osi highlighted, the people who are the most vulnerable are the ones who have been excluded from the trial, which kind of puts a big hole in the whole process of vaccinating. So the way I would look at it is, if you are not sure about it, you could wait. But here's the problem. Waiting can be very detrimental for your most vulnerable patient. There is good quality data from the rheumatology groups on what to do as far as vaccination is concerned in patients who are on immunosuppressants. The first thing is about safety. The second thing is about efficacy. As far as the safety is concerned, the Covishield is a non-replicative vector. Therefore, hopefully, it should not be an issue. The Covaxin anyway is a dead vaccine, so it should not be an issue in terms of safety. Efficacy remains a concern. Obviously, the more profoundly immunosuppressed you are, the worse the response to the vaccine. So generally speaking, if you look at the rheumatology advice, they say that if you're on less than 20 milligrams of prednisolone equivalent per day, you do have a reasonable immune response. So if you want, the best time to do it is to have a gap between your immunosuppressive drugs and your vaccination, so that you get the maximum benefit out of the vaccine, and then restart it at least 4 weeks later if it is possible, or bring down the immunosuppression to as little as possible. So if you can bring it down to just about 20 milligrams or less of prednisone per day or prednisone equivalent, it should be reasonable. Again, not all drugs are created equal. Small dose of methotrexate may be okay, but other alkylating agents and all that may not be okay. So it depends on the amount of immunosuppression you're using. Remember, when you do this, the efficacy is the one which takes a banging. The other option is to consider ring vaccination, which is something that we do in our transplant patients, which basically means if you can't vaccinate the index person. Now, in this case, it's a healthcare provider, therefore it is very, very difficult. But let us say it is a transplant recipient or a person with lupus who's on high-grade immunosuppression, something like that. The risk is highest from their own family members. So one option is to vaccinate all the people who come into very close contact with that person, so that their immune response will act like a mini herd and therefore protect that person. So herd ring vaccination could be a strategy. But all in all, in general, if your immunosuppression is very minimal, the safety and the efficacy are reasonable. And again, hesitation should be as minimal as possible in these kind of settings.
Well said, sir. Just a few points. As you said, cocooning, that is, vaccinating the family is important, as well as such patients, they have to continue to use mask and other protective things like what we use now, that is physical distancing and hand rub. And this is important because we don't know how the efficacy of this vaccine in such populations. So they get vaccinated, they cocoon, that is vaccinate the immediate family members, as well as follow all the COVID precautions that are in place already. But there's one more that I want to highlight is please read the package insert, because as of Covaxin, there is a specific contraindication for all such individuals. That means any immunocompromised, there's a mention as a definite contraindication for such vaccine. So you have to be sure of what vaccine you're taking and what are the contraindication that is given in the package insert, and then follow that. In Covishield, it is there is no contraindications, but so you go by the package insert. So again, these are the other special population, immunocompromised host. We have touched upon the transplant population as well as the steroids and DMRD's use. What about pre-transplant? As you said, how can you plan the vaccine pre-transplant? And what are the precautions in HSCT?
Yeah, so that's a bit of a problem. Solid organ and stem cell are going to be very different. In solid organ, generally speaking, we prefer at least a month from vaccination to go for the transplant. Because if you're going to do the transplant within, say, 2 weeks' time, you're not really going to get the benefit of it. So remember, if it's 2 doses, you have to start at least 2 months ahead. And for most solid organ transplants, you do have time. For most liver transplants, unless it's an acute liver failure, in which case there's no question of waiting for vaccination. Kidney failure, anyway, there's no problem. You have dialysis. So wait on it and then go for the transplant. Because post-transplant efficacy is going to be really poor. Stem cell transplant is a bit of a problem because whatever immunity you're going to generate from the vaccine is going to get wiped out by the stem cell transplant process itself. So the better option is to wait for about 6 months after transplant and then vaccinate the recipient, provided their immune status is reasonable. And again, here, the ring vaccination is still an option. Obviously, you need to make sure that all members of the healthcare team are also included in the ring. It's not just the family, it is also all caregivers, which is healthcare team members, should also get the vaccination to protect the recipient as well as possible.
Okay. What about chemo? So is there a time spacing
yeah.
between chemo and vaccine?
That's a bit of a problem because it all depends on how aggressive the chemo is and how urgently it's required. There is obviously cancers and there are cancers. So if it's a low-grade malignancy and you have time, then you use the time wisely to get the vaccine in, both doses, and then wait for 4 weeks after that to start chemo. On the other hand, if it's a high-grade malignancy and you need to start chemo immediately, then obviously it's a bit of a problem. Your only option is ring vaccination. And if you've finished chemo and if you have a break, you need to be 4 weeks off chemotherapy, preferably for your immune system to kind of bounce back. And then if you give the vaccine, after that, you have to wait 1 more month to give the second dose. And after that, you'd preferably want to wait another 4 weeks for the immunogenicity of the vaccine to be established before you go for chemo. Unfortunately, most oncologists will probably shoot you like a duck if you suggest that they go off chemotherapy for 3 months. So that may not be an option. And again, here, I think ring vaccination would probably be the most sane choice. But if you have the opportunity to vaccinate them with breaks in between, we should utilize that as effectively as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is determined by the underlying type of cancer and the urgency that it needs attention to. Thank you. Okay, so how do you go about this? There is a history of COVID-19 recently, and then he comes with a report of IgG titer of 156 SARS-CoV-2 IgG titer. Is it relevant? When should he get vaccinated? Can I request Dr. George to handle this?
Sure. I mean, this question, if you ask most people, and also the recommendation is that they will say you go ahead and vaccinate. That's the recommendation. However, if you think deeper, there is much more to it. When you have, a situation of previous infection and vaccination, 2 questions which you will ask yourself is, what is the risk of reinfection? And secondly, how long does the immunity last after the natural infection? So there is a good study which recently published from the UK with more than 20,000 healthcare workers. They found that there is a reduced risk of infection by 83% at the end of 5 months. And they also found that reinfection occurs only in less than 1%. Very good insight from that. So although people have noted that the antibody levels come down, say in 3 to 6 months' time, one thing which we forget to about is the cell-mediated immune response. There are memory T cells which we don't normally measure. I mean, we can measure. You have to do something like an IGRA, very tedious process. As part of research, many a times we do that. So I think although everybody recommends a vaccination, including ACIP, I can see that Rajalakshmi has quoted ACIP and said, you revaccinate. There is much more to it. So I think it's a healthcare worker, it's a doctor who is coming. He is well aware of the evidence. It should be an informed decision, is what my suggestion would be.
Yeah. So there is good recommendations to say that even if you have had COVID, it is justified to go ahead with this vaccine. And the timing of vaccine may be a discussion. The sense when to get vaccinated, immediately, how much later, and so on. And the recommendation is you can wait up to 3 months to get vaccinated, but you can get vaccinated as early as 4 weeks. And once your isolation, acute illness is over and your isolation precautions are removed. So these are the take-home messages that you don't go by serology post-vaccination, whether you're immune or not, because that doesn't reflect your immunity. And number two, even if you had COVID, you are still eligible for COVID vaccine. Time it accordingly, as it can be as short as 4 weeks and as long as 12 weeks after the COVID infection. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. This is a 56-year-old gentleman with diabetes and hypertension, and he receives his COVID-19 vaccine, the first dose. Now, 5 days later, he's coming with fever and myalgia. So what do you think are the possibilities? And Dr. Vasant, would you like to address this, please?
Yeah, so here's there's a 56-year-old male diabetic and hypertensive who has received his first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. And he comes to you with fever and myalgia 5 days later. So very clear that normally vaccine, whatever minor side effects of fever, body ache, joint pains happen within the first 48 or maximum 72 hours. So this, in fact, majority of them, whatever I have collected from the healthcare workers who have got vaccinated, within 24 hours they get the symptoms. So this person is coming after 5 days later. Fever, myalgia is most likely it is not related to the COVID-19 vaccine. So one thing is, I would like to rule out any other. I would deal with as any fever of a person who has not been vaccinated. So I would rule out all possibilities: malaria, UTI, dengue, and all that. And possibly most important is I would also look at, in this pandemic, any fever as of now. There's no malaria, no dengue, but I would look at as whether this is a COVID infection, because after the COVID vaccination being taken, for the person that vaccine to be efficacious takes at least 10 to 14 days. So he is in between. Neither he is in the adverse events of the vaccine, neither he is in the efficacy period of the vaccine. So that means either he is having possibly a fresh COVID-19 infection, which is possible. At the same time, you have to rule out other causes of fever. It could be any fever. It could be non-specific other viral fevers. It could be malaria, dengue. So I would investigate him. But the first thing I would do is I would do a RT-PCR in him. And first thing is, in this pandemic, any fever I would consider as COVID-19 until and unless proven. So this is how I would go. And I think you have said possibility fever, myalgia, fever and cough. So I think I would definitely go for RT-PCR. Whether it's a conventional or gene expert, that doesn't matter. But I would go ahead and do RT-PCR. If that is negative, then I would look for other causes of fever. And that is how I would address this gentleman with diabetes and hypertension.
Sure. So in these two possibilities, the patient actually turned out to be, suppose he turns out to be COVID-19 positive, and then he receives the convalescent plasma therapy. Then subsequently he recovers and also has completed his 14 days of isolation. So when should he get vaccinated for the COVID vaccine again?
Yeah, so I think there's very clear, clear recommendations on this part, that normally once a patient receives any of the monoclonal antibodies or convalescent plasmas or immunoglobulins, the vaccine will not be effective and he has to wait for at least 90 days from the first symptom onset to get his vaccination done. So if he takes his vaccine earlier, that would not serve a purpose, but it will not be efficacious. So I think the timeline given is that 90 days from the first day of the symptom when he develops. I think I will tell him to wait for at least 3 months time and then get vaccinated. That would be my recommendation for him.
Absolutely. So it's basically 90 days from the onset of infection. And similarly, if patient has received any monoclonal antibodies against same thing, the patient has to wait for at least 90 days. Now, now this is a 23-year-old young plastic surgeon who has received his COVID vaccine, and he is still worried about like whether he's going to get infection and how long to wear the mask post-vaccination. Dr. Subra, would you like to address this, please?
So whether it's the mRNA vaccine or the Oxford vaccine or the Sputnik vaccine or the Wuhan vaccine, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Remember that no vaccine is 100% protective. Why are we doing this? We are doing this because we are pushing towards herd immunity. Therefore, even those who are vaccinated but do not seroconvert are protected because of the herd effect. So therefore, it's going to take time. Therefore, yes, even if you've taken the vaccine, one, in the initial phase, at least it takes time for your immunity to seroconvert to a protective phase. Two, not everybody will convert. And three, we don't know how long it will last. So for very many reasons, please understand that the possibility of infection is still there. The risk is significantly reduced, but not zero. The second thing is, what about mask? Well, last year was a year of COVID. This year shall be year of mask. So let's learn to live with the mask at least for this year. My prediction for this year is till Diwali this year, we get to wear a mask at a bare minimum. So let's just enjoy it while it lasts.
So we have to continue mask till Diwali. Let's see. So I think in this particular, I mean, after the vaccination, do we really need to have a post-vaccination antibody titers? What is the importance? And what is this correlate of protection? Dr. George?
Yeah, the best correlate of protection is measuring the clinical efficacy, of course. In a particular individual, you can measure neutralizing antibodies. However, the neutralizing antibody measurement is not an easy task. You have to do this in viral cell cultures in terms of doing the test. So this is a tedious process. There are surrogate ways of doing this. People look at the titers. However, the correlation has not been very well made. Usually, people say that if you have 10 units per mil, the protection is reasonable, but that is a very rough estimate. The correlates of protection, not only for antibodies, you also need to look at the cell-mediated immunity. There are ways of doing it, but not very practical on an individual basis.
Yeah, so probably some efficacy trials which are actually difficult to do, but probably some of the centers might be, they are doing it as well. Coming to the special population again, Dr. Rajlakshmi, please go ahead.
Dr. Vasan, what do you advise if a pregnant woman or young reproductive women who's planning pregnancy or a lactating woman come and ask for a vaccine? Do we have any recommendations, especially on children? And
so, as far as the pregnancy part goes, there was no enrollment of pregnant women in neither the Pfizer or Moderna trials, or neither clearly no one was in both the vaccines which are available in India, the Covishield and the Covaxin. Having said that, the CDC, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, as well as the British College of Obstetrics and Gynecology have clearly given a green signal for not only people who want to get pregnant, but even for pregnant women, they can get vaccinated with a written consent, because there's no real-time data on this, but it is supposed to be fairly safer. So that is one thing. So as if the pregnant woman has been, has been given for going for vaccination, I see no contraindication for people who want to get pregnant, and why should they not get vaccinated, because it's always better. In fact, my strong recommendation would be all those people who are going to want to get a pregnancy should be vaccinated, because to prevent a COVID disease, which could be severe during the pregnancy and then prevent it. So very clear message, you have to get vaccinated, whether you want to get pregnant or if you want to. So there's no question on that. You have to get vaccinated from that point of view. But yes, with a written consent for pregnant women. For those who want to get pregnant, you have to go in for vaccination. But then again, it's a individualized voluntary decision. So whether about, again, for pregnancy, lactation, there's no contraindication from that as far as the recommendation go, but with a written consent. Children's, I think there's no data on this except for the Pfizer vaccine above 16. And I think the new trial, which is going on with about 12 years of age. I think with the time coming, it may be below 12 years. So far it is between 16 and 18. Even for the AstraZeneca vaccine, it is more than 18 years of age. And for the mRNA also, it is more than 18 years, except for the Pfizer, which is more than 16. And the Pfizer has started with a new trial about 12 years of age to get into this. The efficacy data in the elderly, again, we don't have any data, as was clearly mentioned earlier, that in Covaxin as well as Covishield, this group of people have not been considered. So we don't have any data from the Indian side. As far as the Pfizer and the mRNA vaccine, in the phase 2 trial, they found that the antibody response was slightly lower, but said that in the phase 3 trial, they showed a good efficacy even in the elderly population. And so they are, so the indication that yes, you go and get vaccinated. But they are excluded people who have been completely bedridden or extremely old age, they are excluded. So efficacy data in elderly in the phase 3 trial is fairly good for the elderly population. And I think, yes, it is a go ahead for vaccinating the people. And even in India, I think after the healthcare workers, the next in line will be the elderly population. And I think it will be a yes to go ahead for the vaccine for this group also.
Thank you. Just to reiterate, in pregnant, please understand the risk-benefit benefit of the vaccine and explain to the beneficiary. In mRNA vaccine, they are given clear guidelines that if it is an informed decision that is taken by the beneficiary, especially if the beneficiary or the vaccine, who's undertaking the vaccine, is a healthcare worker in a high-risk area like emergency department or so, and who's pregnant, it is her decision to go ahead and get the vaccine. So it should be an informed decision by them. So it may not be universal for all pregnant women. So, but the MOH, Government of India have released for both the COVID-19 vaccine that pregnancy is a specific contraindication. So please explain the benefits and risks, and with informed consent only you can go ahead with pregnant women taking this vaccine. As regards to those women who are planning pregnancy, of course, it needs 2 doses, and probably they have to understand that these 2 doses, it's given at a gap of at least 4 weeks, and then plan pregnancy if it's a planned pregnancy.
So I think this is again regarding the use of blood thinners. Yeah.
So we have this, and this will be very, very common problem, using antiplatelets, oral anticoagulants, and we also come across hemophiliacs who come for vaccines, and decompensated liver disease with coagulation disorders. So how do we deal with? Is there a cutoff, or how do we take precautions? Can we go ahead with vaccines, Dr. George?
Yeah, generally the recommendation is if they have been monitoring the INR and if it's in the therapeutic range, they can go ahead and take the vaccine. And the other important recommendation is that when you give vaccine to people who are on these medication, use a smaller gauge needle, usually 24 gauge needle, is what is suggested. So with these, the chance of bleed into the muscle, etc., is very small. So recommendation is vaccinate with caution.
Thank you. And actually, we can extrapolate some of the data from the CDC MMWR regarding the hepatitis B vaccine, which is usually given in Delta, and usually it should be given as IM to get the maximum efficacy. And even for hemophiliacs, they have mentioned to use a 23 gauge needle and give pressure for 2 minutes, and preferably after you transfuse the components. And then probably you can, it should be a planned even for hemophiliacs, but for the rest, I think you can use the smallest gauge, that is 23, and give 2-minute pressure, especially for those on anticoagulants and those who have not a very high INR. So all this have to be kept in mind. And in hemophiliacs, it should be a planned vaccination. Yes,
Okay.
again, I want to reiterate that you please be aware of what vaccine you use, go through the fact sheet of the vaccine for specific contraindications, and then proceed.
Sure. So I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to this question, which is to Dr. Surbhi Madan. Will the vaccine work against the COVID-19 mutant viruses and the variants?
It's a very difficult question. I think we'll come to know with time. Now, it's an RNA virus, and we know the mutations, the rate of mutations which may happen in RNA viruses, like the antigenic drifts which happen in influenza virus, because of which the yearly, every 6-monthly vaccine needs changes according to the viral strain. Now, as far as the data is available at present, in the late 2020, the UK strain was identified, and then we had the South African strain. So we know that mutations are a real-time problem, and they are already happening. Now, fortunately, all the mutations may not have implications in the, the efficacy of the vaccine, that is the immune escape. For example, the UK strain, which has the N105Y501Y mutation, that mutation is known to cause increased transmissibility, that we already know, but it did not lead to decrease in the vaccine. It should not lead to any decrease in the vaccine efficacy, because the convalescent plasma from the participants who had received mRNA vaccine, that could neutralize this strain. However, the South African strain, which has the mutation E408K, that mutation is, it's thought that it may lead to decrease in the efficacy to the vaccine. So yes, mutations are going to be a problem, and we will come to know with time. Now, the vaccine will work, but we don't know what will be the amount of protection which will be conferred by the vaccine, how much, the efficacy which we know at present is 95%, 94%, how much efficacy will, it will go down with the mutations which will become more and more prevalent in the community. So I think we'll get the answer with time. It is very difficult to, there is no clear-cut answer to this question, and with more and more data we'll come to know.
Sure, I think the data is what we need, which will come with time. So this is to all the panelists. When do you guess that India will be able to achieve the herd immunity and vaccination, and at what scale is needed to accomplish this? So Dr. Vasant?
Yeah, I think for developing a herd immunity, you require at least 60 to 70, I would say 70% of the population either should have suffered and having adequate antibodies for the time being, because we do not know about this disease that, person who has got a natural infection, how long will the natural, just like if you have chickenpox, you know that you have lifelong immunity if you through a natural infection. Similarly for COVID, we do not know about how long this infection lasts. So with vaccination, I think minimum 70% of the people either should have suffered or got vaccinated to be developing a herd immunity. And saying that, again, I say that we do not know in a natural immunity how long it would last. And so I would say to develop herd immunity, at least 50 to 70% of the population should be possibly vaccinated, and I don't know, it's a big task. So that is what would be the herd immunity. And I think the second question.
Yeah, Dr. Rajrashmi, would you like read this out, please? Yeah.
When do you expect Pfizer vaccine to be made available? Do you have enough resources to maintain the cold chain as well as to roll out? And if a person who has taken Covishield 2 months ago comes and wants a Pfizer vaccine, will you still advise?
So you're asking me, Rajlakshmi?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think one is, it's a big challenge for a developing country like India to have this Pfizer vaccine, because it has to be stored at -70 and -80 degree centigrade. Having said that, it is not impossible, but I think the other vaccines, that is our Covishield and Covaxin, requires to be stored at between 2 and 8 degrees. So that is the most suited for India. Again, the Moderna vaccine, it requires -20 degrees. Again, that is also a challenge. So I think the best suited present vaccine what we are having is the Covishield and the Covaxin. Both seem to be good for India. Yes, when it comes, we will have to see how we can, at least in the cities is possible, but transporting these vaccines to rural areas and interiors of the villages in India will be a big challenge. So that is one thing. Second thing is, if I've taken a Covishield and for some reason, I would say I should go and vaccinate with a Covishield only, maybe 4 weeks or maybe up to 12 weeks. The 12 weeks thing came into picture because the whole idea of the UK government was to see that every person at least is vaccinated for once in the beginning, and rather than vaccinating who already received vaccines at 2 shots. So that was the whole thing. So you can wait up to 4 to 12 weeks for this. For some reason, if Covishield is not available I would always prefer to go for the same vaccine what I'd taken for the first time. But if some reason the manufacturing or there's a shortage of the vaccines and all that, and if you don't have enough time between the 2 vaccines, then possibly I would go ahead and take the mRNA vaccine which is available, or even the Covaxin which is available. But the guidelines are very clear. It is, you should always try to go in for the same manufacturer vaccine if you can. But for some reason, if you just not be able to do it within the preferred time frame, then you can to go ahead with. But knowing that it is not the way to go ahead.
Okay, I think it's time to take some of the questions in the chat. One question was about HIV and vaccines. Can I ask Dr. Surabhi to address this?
Sure.
So when you advise, can HIV patients take this vaccine, or is there a timing needed or anything?
So HIV patients were included in the clinical trials. The Pfizer included the HIV patients, and even the other trials also included. So yes, likewise, I would extrapolate the data from other vaccines also, like the way we vaccinate HIV patients with other vaccines. Yes, HIV patients should be vaccinated. However, if the CD4 count is too low, if the patient is not virologically suppressed and say CD4 less than 200, where we have the general recommendation, where we are worried about the immunogenicity, there definitely there would be a relative contraindication. But otherwise, I don't see any reason not to vaccinate a fully virologically suppressed and HIV patient.
Okay, so we'll move on to the queries. And the first one is, any absolute contraindication for the COVID-19 vaccine? I think Dr. Subra, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I was just trying to type the answer, but it looks like I hit the wrong button. Yeah, so allergies to any component of the vaccine is considered an absolute contraindication. Obviously, for certain vaccines, like Covaxin, persons with severe immunodeficiency is listed as a contraindication. Actually, it's lack of efficacy more than probably the safety issue. Finally, as of right now, pregnancy would be considered a relative contraindication because we don't have data, and the government has very clearly said that pregnancy should be considered a contraindication till we have more data. So obviously, those are the only things which are a problem. Otherwise, really nothing much.
So this is from Dr. Umang Agarwal. Recently, Ministry of Health guidelines recommend that the immunosuppressed individuals may take either Covishield or Covaxin. However, there are still concerns regarding the Covishield use in such patients. Could you kindly provide clarity on this? So Covishield vaccine definitely can be used in such patients. It's just that the efficacy will be an issue. So I think immunocompromised patients can go ahead with Covishield. What about the other panelist? Dr. George?
Yeah, I think this has already been mentioned. One of the major concern is about the immunity. Immune suppressed individuals. The efficacy what you can get may not be optimal. Secondly, if it's an attenuated virus, there is a small concern. In certain populations, one will be very careful in recommending it. But Covishield, in the trial, they had not included, they had excluded most of those kind of individuals, and therefore it is difficult to say with certainty what will be the result in those.
Dr. Subra, your opinion on this?
Well, okay. So, 1 second. So, I agree with George. Let me put it simply that way. I agree with George.
Sure. So, if there is allergy to the seafood, prawn, and elephant foot, yam, can I advise him Covishield? Dr. Surbi?
See, Covishield back insert very clearly says that if there is any history of food allergy or any other drug allergy, then you have to be cautious. Neither of these vaccines, I don't think the component or the the excipient contains any of the these sort this which he has mentioned. So I don't think there should be a problem unless he's suffering from a very severe food allergy like severe urticaria or hives. Then we have to be really cautious. And the CDC advises to observe these persons at the vaccination site and center for at least 30 minutes with a crash cart available. So that would be the advice to this patient, to this person.
True, absolutely. So recently there was, if there is allergy to say another vaccine, say like a severe local site reaction to pneumococcal vaccine, in that case, would you advise the patient to take the vaccine, or it will be just wait and watch?
It's very difficult to say what is the reason for that local site vaccine reaction. Now, aluminium is a common component in both Covishield as well as the pneumococcal vaccine, if you see. So if that is the reason, the adsorbent aluminium which is used, then this person is probably going to get allergy to the Covishield also. So he needs to be explained this very clearly, that there is a possibility of getting the same reaction. And we need to get ready, all our antihistaminics and be ready to be prepared with the anaphylactic reactions also. With consent, definitely we can go ahead, but it's not a compulsory vaccine. What I believe is, if there is any major risk involved, if he has already, if I would put it that way, if I have a reaction, a severe local site reaction with a pneumococcal vaccine, I would probably wait for, and probably try to get away with the mask rather than subjecting myself to a vaccine which has the same which shares the common excipient, and where there is a high probability of getting a reaction again. I would put it that way.
Absolutely. I think because of this reason, allergy to vaccines is also termed as a contraindication in the recent Ministry of Health guidelines. Yeah. Then we have addressed the issue of COVID vaccination in pregnancy and nursing women. Dr. Rajlakshmi, can you see the questions?
Yeah, there's one question. Can a person with atopic dermatitis with allergic rhinitis take Covishield? And there is also another question on immunosuppressive drugs. I think we have addressed the immunosuppressive drugs aspect, and allergy and allergic rhinitis, which is not related to any food or any drugs or vaccine. I think it will not be a concern. Allergic to any products, therapeutic products is what the concern or specific contraindication that is mentioned in the government guidelines.
Well, if that were a problem based on my sniffling right now, I can't take the vaccine, but I intend to take it. So there you go.
Allergic
Raji,
is so common in our country. Yeah, it is so common, allergic rhinitis.
Yeah, Raji and Neha, I think we are around 8:35,
Okay.
and you both have been looking into the chat boxes. But the question answers now, we've had around 168 questions there. So you guys have not looked into it. Probably I've tried answering around 100 into it. I just thought that there was a common recurring theme in those questions.
Okay.
I would just put it across for much more clarity as key take-home messages for the audience. One thing is, should we take the vaccine? I would just ask all the panelists to answer in a simple word. We will start with Dr. George. Should we take the vaccine?
Well, that answer is very clear. You should take the vaccine, but
Yes.
which one, when, all those are the more difficult questions to answer.
We'll start with
depending
simple
on the
ones. Yeah. Yes. I think we should take the vaccine. I don't think there should be any kind of doubt on it. And Covishield or Covaxin at this point of time, what would the panelists as well as the moderators would prefer? We don't need any explanations. Just choose one, Covishield or Covaxin at this point of time, based upon the efficacy data, safety data, whatever it is, the bridge study data in India, Covishield or Covaxin. Dr. George?
Yeah, I would go for Covishield.
Okay. Dr. Neha?
So I will also go for Covishield.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Rajalakshmi?
Covishield.
Sorry. Covishield. Dr. Surabhi?
Covishield.
Okay. Dr. Subramaniam?
Can I ask for the Pfizer one?
It's not available. So we need to be practical.
I have to ask. No, but jokes apart, seriously. I think we are making too much of a deal about Covishield, Covaxin. I think it's prudent for us to wait, but I suspect in a month's time, we will see that probably Covaxin will be comparable to Covishield in terms of its efficacy. That's what my gut instinct is telling me. So at this point, actually speaking, I'm not too worried about which vaccine I get. I'm actually comfortable with either of them.
Okay, good. Dr. Vasant?
Yeah, I agree with Subra. I'm on the same platform as Subra because I don't think Covishield, though there is slightly more data, but I think Covaxin should be also equally safer and maybe more safer also. We do not know because it's like completely inactivated vaccine. So so I would say sometimes I have in mind, should I go in for Covaxin rather than Covishield?
Yep. I think Covaxin is available only in 6 cities as of now. We don't have Covaxin here.
If given a choice.
Yeah. If given a choice, right. Mumbai, I suppose you have both, right?
Yeah, we have both.
If you go by the vote of the panelists, looks like 4:2. 4:2. Okay, that probably this would change in a couple of weeks as time progresses. We do not know. People with underlying comorbidities, people who are elderly. So which vaccine is relatively safe at this point of time?
So Nambi, I would prefer to go in for though the Covaxin says no, but I believe that would be comparatively safer. Both are equally safe, but it's a completely inactivated vaccine similar to an influenza vaccine. So of course the platform is different, but I think that would be, my take would be even for patients who are transplants or immunosuppressants, I would go in for a kill inactivated vaccine possibly compared to the Covishield if given a choice, but both are safe.
Both are safe. Dr. George, what would be your choice for comorbidities, someone who is elderly?
So to answer that question, I think they are the ones, the vulnerable group are the ones who should get the vaccine. They are the ones who will benefit the most. So I have no hesitation in recommending the vaccine to the elderly and the other vulnerable population. The only question is, between the two, people will be more comfortable in taking the one with more data which is available. 1 month down the line, when you have enough data, the situation may totally change. And again, the efficacy will also come into play once we have the mRNA vaccines available. To me, the mRNA vaccine is actually going to change the landscape of vaccine in the future. So down the line, maybe 1 month, 2 months down the line, the whole picture will be totally different.
And maybe the vaccine will take care of, the mutants also. Probably we can manufacture at a faster pace, considering the mutants.
Dr. Rajyalakshmi, which vaccine would you prefer for your special population? Elderly people, comorbidities, immune compromised host.
As of now, I will go ahead with Covishield, but as Covaxin is an inactivated vaccine and we have more data with previous vaccines, and the month's time, as we have more data, probably I'll be more comfortable with that.
Dr. Surabhi, your choice?
Same as Dr. Rajyalakshmi.
Dr. Neha, you have any different thoughts?
Covaxin, if I think about it, it's basically seems to be much safer vaccine. Only issue is that usually the inactivated vaccines are associated with lower immunogenicity. So that may be little lower as compared to the ChAdOx vaccine.
And the problem with Covaxin is they have now put a definite contraindication for the immunocompromised people. So how will it generate data? They're not even trying in that population. It's a definite contraindication in their package insert.
You mean to say Covaxin, the package insert says avoid use in immunocompromised host? Okay, fine. Dr. Subra, your thoughts?
See, most of my vulnerable hosts, I would prefer, I'm actually happy with either. But in a post-transplant setting, the concept of giving a live virus vaccine is something that makes my stomach turn ever so slowly. So I would probably soft pedal over there and think of maybe the mRNA vaccine or maybe the Covaxin for now, while I wait for more data. But having said that, I strongly suspect that either of those would be acceptable options in practically everybody outside of pregnant women, for which I think we need to have specific data.
Subra, you would label Covishield, the ChAdOx vaccine, as a live virus vaccine?
Okay. So here we go. See, it's not classified as a killed vaccine. It is not classified as a subunit vaccine. There's only one other category left. They have called it a non-replicative viral vector. So they have said, we have monkeyed around with it and we have taken out the DNA which is required for it to replicate. It still means they have not killed it. Yes, the theory is it cannot replicate. Unfortunately, it has never been tested in profoundly immunosuppressed people. So for that reason, I'm still hedging my bets. Instinctively, you would think that since it's an absolutely incapable of replication, it should be no issues at all. But having said that, the threshold for safety is much higher, in a person who's profoundly immunosuppressed, like stem cell transplant or say lung transplant and things like that. So for those situations, I would want a little more data.
Fine. So it is not labeled as a live virus vaccine, but looking at the vaccine make, it looks like that you think it is a live virus vaccine. Okay. So because it is not labeled, so that's a problem there to call it as a live virus vaccine.
No, they call it a non-replicative viral vector. They have not called it killed. It's definitely not subunit. It is not killed. So what is it? So it stands for
the adenovirus is the non-replicating virus vector.
Correct. So it's not a killed virus. If it was a killed virus, they'd call it a killed virus vaccine. So what is it?
Dr. George, you would like to add something? Yeah.
Subra, when you have these vectors, I'll give you an example. When you have the plasmid, most common vectors used are the plasmid ones. They will not, it's not something which will cause the replication and then infection in the host. So I don't think that may be that will be a concern. It is a newer platform. It's a newer technology. I agree. But I don't think you can equate it to a live virus.
No. See, the point is, if you look at all the international societies, whether the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplant or any of the comparable societies, they've all only approved the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA-based vaccine technology. They have not given any instructions on the Gamaleya vaccine or the the Oxford vaccine, mainly because they were hesitating on this particular issue. I can tell you that, because That's what is happening. They want more data for them to be able to say that it's an acceptable option in this population. It probably is. It probably is, in that they are non-replicative. But having said that, the burden of proof is higher in this setting.
Looks like I'm getting food and fuel for another webinar. There could be a debate on whether it is a live virus or it is a killed vaccine. And another common recurring theme in the questions that I have seen is, if someone has had an infection, does he require a vaccine? If so, when? And if that person happens to be a healthcare worker, does the need for vaccine change when compared to a common man? So Subra, what do you think? I think Dr. George made his point very clear in his answer, so I would not ask him again. I would ask you.
No, see, the problem is, like has been very clearly pointed out, we don't know the durability of response. The good news is you're not going to get the infection very quickly, and the chance of it happening again seems to be fairly remote. But having said that, it's not 100% protection. So yes, we'd like to think that natural immunity is probably profound and long lasting, but however, we know that for many infections, it's not necessarily true. Therefore, it makes sense for us to boost it with the vaccine, irrespective of whether we had the infection or the vaccine is giving us a first exposure to the virus. Second, there is no reliable way of finding out if we have protective immunity, because one, we are testing for non-specific antibodies, not the spike antibodies. And two, we don't have mechanisms like George pointed out of doing T-cell mediated immunity like IGRA and stuff like that. So there are too many confounders here. The easier answer is to just take the shot and be done with it and live a happier life.
When would you recommend taking the vaccine shot after the infection?
So generally, I would probably think not less than 4 weeks after recovery.
Okay, fine. Does the other panel members have a different thought on patients with infection? Should they or not take a vaccine? Someone thinks that they should not be a vaccine candidate. Dr. Neha, what do you think? Rajalakshmi, Surabhi, and Dr. Vasant.
So I agree with Dr. Subra. Of course, they should take the vaccine.
Okay.
Depending if it was not in not in the short supply, probably we could have delayed it for 3 months or so. But in today's scenario, if your chance comes, take it at 4 weeks from the recovery. Besides, I think it's a T-cell based immune response. So obviously, with the next exposure, there is likelihood of a better immune response or protection.
One thing which I always wonder is if there is good antibody response after a natural infection, is it going to alter the immune response to vaccine in any form? You know, there are terms called immune tolerance and blocking antibodies and all. Should we really, you know, is there any concern if a patient already has good antibodies and then we vaccinate that patient? Is there going to be any interference with the already existing antibodies?
I think no one really knows. No one really knows. If someone has an infection and then takes a vaccine, the antibody dependent enhancement immune response is supposed to be not a problem, but it can be the other way around. Someone has the infection, someone takes a vaccine and then gets the infection. So can it interfere in a different way? So there are different thought process for both the sequence. You take the vaccine, then you have an infection. What's going to happen? You had an infection, then you take the vaccine. I think right now we don't have much clarity on what is going to happen. And COVID is one situation where we all know that we do not know much. And only time gives us answers. We were like the same when we were starting with the epidemic last year in May, June. But right now, at least with treatment, we have much more clarity. With vaccines, as time passes, probably another 2-3 months, we'll have much more clarity. I think we are almost.
I wanted to comment on this.
Yes. Yeah.
So to continue with Surabhi, I was thinking if you have got adequate antibodies, just like hepatitis B, an exposure to another COVID or whatever COVID patient or whatever, you don't know, it might boost up your immunity further. So working in the COVID ward itself might keep boosting your antibody titers. We don't know that. So that we still don't know about it. And second thing is I would say I would wait for 90 days because there's a clear CDC guideline which says that you are not going to have a reinfection or a new infection up to 90 days from the first. So if given a chance, I would allow my colleagues who are antibody negative to go ahead and vaccinate. And I would wait for my turn after 90 days if I had suffered from COVID in the past. But again, I still want to, I'm with Surabhi that I want to have more clarity on this, what is going to have, because the T cell immunity has been clearly in the UK been demonstrated up to 6 months. And I do not know whether we'll have that ELISpot or something to measure the T cell immunity for the future.
Just quickly to add on to Vasant, the concern is the story in dengue. When there was, the dengue vaccine was rolled out on a large scale, they found that the hospitalization and the severe dengue in those people who had antibodies positive was higher. What is called as this antibody-mediated enhancement. That is actually the concern. Do we have enough data to say that we know that the antibody-mediated enhancement to some extent occurs, but does it cause any clinical? Does it have any clinical implication? Is something which we need to watch out.
I think it's time to wind up. It's 8:50 p.m. Any key pressing messages, probably one-line message from the panelists or the moderators that you want to say something? Any key pressing messages? A take-home message for the audience. So we've had around 700 logins today. So we had around 535 through Zoom and around 200 through the YouTube. So that was a good attendance at a short notice. So we had released the brochure, everything on this Monday, Tuesday, and to have around 700 participants for this is great. And that tells the interest among the participants with respect to, or the uncertainty with respect to the COVID vaccines. Any key pressing messages that we have to give to the audience? You could start with Subra. You want to say something quick?
Yeah, so please take your vaccine. That's the best investment you can do for a better future. And Nambi, brilliant work.
Oh, thank you. Surabhi, you want to say something?
I think the message is the same. Please take your vaccine. Safety concerns are much lesser as compared to the efficacy which has already been proven in the trials.
Vasant?
I think whichever vaccine is offered to you, whether it's a Covishield or Covaxin, whatever is offered to you, please go ahead and take it, because vaccination is better than getting the COVID disease.
That's nicely summed up. Neha, you want to say something?
Yeah, of course, take your vaccine and please continue the precautions, wear your mask. And I can actually see many people requesting for Dr. Ozzi's presentation.
Yeah, I was about to announce that. Yeah, all this entire discussion that we've had from 7 p.m. to 8:50 p.m. Will be available in YouTube. All you have to type is CIDS webinars, CIDS CIDS, that stands for Clinical Infectious Diseases Society and webinar. You would have access to this event plus all our past webinars that we have conducted in the last year. And this event will be put up in our website, www.sidsindia.org, which has links to all our previous COVID webinars, plus our SIDSCon, whatever we had a 9-day event SIDSCon. All the lectures are put up there for public viewing. So nothing is sacrosanct here. It is quite open for public to see and get the knowledge what has to be shared. And any other pressing key message from Dr. George and Dr. Ozzi? I could see them here.
The same about taking the vaccine, but in addition, I think lot of the herd immunity in several parts of the country has already occurred. In Tamil Nadu, if you see, the life is almost back to normal, and the number of cases what we are seeing is very, very small. So that is actually reassuring. The fact that there is, we have seroprevalence data available. So vaccination is an additional armamentarium for us to protect ourselves and get back to normal life as quickly as possible.
You want to say something?
Yeah, what all the others said, take the vaccine, follow the precautions, but one more plea. Let's have the same kind of response to all other infections we have in our country.
Important, yes. Absolutely, yes.
COVID is right now top on the list. I agree that tuberculosis is a much bigger problem than COVID. Hopefully the lessons that we learned from the COVID saga helps us in taking care of all other infections, as nicely put up. It will be pneumonia, the gastroenteritis, the urinary tract infections, and of course the tuberculosis, HIV, all those bigger ones, bigger killer ones. And I think with that, we would close this session. I thank the viewers, the audience, the participants for giving us the courage and encouragement to proceed with such similar activities. And as I had said earlier, all the activities are available in SIDS webinar, YouTube. You just need to type in SIDS webinar and it will be put up in our website, www.sids.india.org. I humbly request Indian clinicians interested in Infectious Disease Society to join our society. Please. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much, Nambi.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic show. And thank you very much to all.
Very well done. Very well. Very loose.
Very well done. Very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Nambi.
bye.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I would feel in my duty if I have given an acknowledgement, failed to give an acknowledgement to the Hallmark events. They were the event organizer, and all I have to do is send in a WhatsApp message to them, and they were quick enough to respond and then set it up in terms of reminders, sending in mails. Thanks to the Hallmark events who've been partnering with SIDS for all such our academic activities. Thanks to Hallmark and Sheshadri and team at Hallmark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.